Hello, BYU Cougar fans. Welcome to the Blue Cougar Football Podcast. What's on my mind? I apologize for missing the last couple days. It's been pretty hectic, and believe it or not, doing these things every day is a little harder than you would expect. But I'm still going to try and put them out as much as I can. I'm not going to adjust the schedule and hopefully get this thing up much more regularly every day, but got a few things on my mind, a few things to talk about that you won't find in any of the other stories on the site. Starting off, you've probably seen it already, but in case you haven't, the Deseret News is running a special preview from the book called The System. There's a chapter on Kyle Van Noy. Incredible story about Kyle Van Noy in there. Looks like we have our own Forrest Gump on the BYU football team, and amazing how the whole recruiting process started and went for him, and just a great insight, great story, and I'm probably going to buy the book just for that alone. So go on to DeseretNews.com and you should find it. It's really good read. Another nice story. I find it hard to believe, but I'm going to trust that it's true. It just seems like it's too good to be true. But then again, what else about Ziggy Ansah is not? If you go to OgletreeFootball.com, again, OgletreeFootball.com, that's Brandon Ogletree's site. He talks about the first time he met Ziggy and a little more background leading up to Ansah's big year last year. And I mean, it's one of those things that only a former player can give you. And so that's one thing that makes that site great, and why I love it when former players do this. All right. A video that you definitely want to see, makes you real proud to be a Cougar, is on ESPN. As you well may know, former BYU offensive lineman Trevor Matich. He was the center on the national championship football team back in 1984. He now does college football commentary for ESPN. But he was asked about some recent reports that some players received illegal benefits, and he shares a story about how he was approached before the Holiday Bowl, the national championship year, and people wanted to give him money, and talks about how he turned that down. And it's really nice, really cool to hear that story, and he also gives some other good insights about the problems in college football. So if you haven't seen it, you can all try and find it and tweet out a link to it. It's really good and really cool to hear that it's not just BYU is good because they're not tempted, but to know that BYU players, when they are tempted and offered opportunities to cheat, that they turn them down. All right, one thing, kind of interesting little tidbit here. Wish it wasn't this way, but it is, because I wish we were undefeated right now. But BYU sits 1-1 on the season. The loss to Virginia dropped us to 1-3 all time against the Cavaliers. But our win, though, is against the Texas Longhorns, and that win moves us to the opposite, 3-1 all time against Texas. So kind of interesting how that works. So we're 500 on the year, and overall 500 against both those teams in our history. Had the results been the opposite way, we beat Virginia and lose to Texas, we'd still be 500, and we'd actually have a 2-2 record against each of them all time. So that's just a little numbers fun for you if you like the numbers. Speaking of numbers fun, Taysom Hill has inspired me to look for other instances when 259 yards came up in BYU football history. As you know, he rushed for 259 yards against Texas, and I found that Steve Sarkisian had 259 yards passing in 1996 in the 58-9 blowout of Arkansas State. And, well, yeah, I know that's Arkansas State, but it was that game that year that showed to me that BYU would truly have a special team that year and a special season. That was coming right off the win against Texas A&M in the Pigskin Classic. And that's, I mean, BYU's had big upsets before, but it's a total domination, total blowout of a really inferior team that, especially the week after when you're having that hangover effect, when BYU totally dominated Arkansas State, it told me, okay, this team is going to be different because even, I mean, there was no hangover, or even with the hangover, we destroyed this team. And so that was the sign to me that there's something different about this team, and it was going to be a special year, and lo and behold, it did turn out to be a special year. And the other 259-yard performance that I found was Gordon Hudson, tight end, back in the early 80s, had 259 receiving yards as a sophomore in 1981 against the Utah Utes. So maybe that's kind of a nice little omen there for us with the Utes coming up on the schedule next, that we'll beat them and do it in a nice fashion. That year, 81, BYU beat Utah 56-28. Total beatdown when the Utes were supposed to be a really, really good team. The winner of that game was going to be the WAC champion, and BYU made it clear that even if in the standings we're right next to each other, on the field we are still far, far apart. Okay, one other thing on my mind. I did the weekly report for BYU players in the NFL this week. Put the link out on Twitter, and that kind of started a conversation. As you can imagine, a lot of people are disappointed that BYU does not have more players in the NFL. We're down to just a handful, and pretty much all of them, since Dennis Pitta is injured and Austin Collie is snake-bitten, pretty much all these players are defensive players. So for a school like BYU with quite a reputation for offense, is represented only by defense in the NFL. And as I said, just a handful of players, when even just a couple years ago we were well into the double digits. So it is kind of disappointing, and there's a lot of reasons, a lot of factors going into play there. I think during the Lavelle Edwards era, there was a lot more trust between the NFL and just the players that Edwards would put out. And so they would draft more BYU players. They would trust them more. That if they had to pick between a BYU guy and another guy, they would go with the BYU guy. Also, though, the NFL has changed a lot in the last 1 to 2 decades. And age is, they put a huge premium on age. So with BYU guys 2 years older just from missions alone, which sometimes, based on the timing of it, can turn it into 3 years, it's a huge disadvantage. Now they'll look at that and say, okay, we have a 26-year-old football player or a 23-year-old football player. We'll go with the 23-year-old. And I think, I don't have any hard stats on this, but I think there's a lot more BYU players, or at least more BYU players, who are return missionaries now than there was in the 80s or 90s. And again, there's also a stigma of BCS school or non-BCS school, and so while BYU is respected a lot as a program, which I talked about the other day, in the college football ranks, when it comes to the NFL, there's some stereotypes that BYU football players really need to overcome, not having played every week a Big 12 or a Big 10 or an SEC schedule and put up these stats against that type of competition. So while I think there's a lot of BYU players who could have had successful NFL careers in the last several years, like Andrew George, I don't understand how he didn't make it. I thought he was real quality tight end. Played a lot in the shadow of Dennis Pitta, but still found a way to shine in his own way. I thought he was worthy of an NFL career, at least for 4 or 5 years, but he didn't stick. And so it's really difficult for BYU players now, and a lot of succeeding in the NFL is getting in the right place at the right time. John Beck had all the measurables, and I really was hoping he would have something special, but just couldn't get in that right situation. Alright, so that's what's on my mind today. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week, next Monday, with more Rivalry Week. Go Cougars!